You know, when we hear the term third world today, our minds almost automatically jump to images of poverty, right? Instability, underdevelopment. It's become this negative shorthand, a label that kind of implies failure. But what if I told you that term wasn't about economics at all? That its original meaning had absolutely nothing to do with being less than. It was, in fact, a powerful declaration of political identity. It was a radical statement of revolutionary hope. Today, we're going to uncover that real, forgotten story of the third world. Okay, so let's break this down. We all know the terms. The first world, that was the capitalist West, led by the United States. The second world was the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. But the third, what was it really? Well, it was never ever intended as a ranking, like it was in last place on some global podium. No way. The original idea was something way more profound, way more inspiring. It was all about forging a third path, a new way forward in a world that was basically screaming at every nation to pick a side. It was a declaration of independence not just from one colonial master, but from the entire global power structure.
So the original meaning actually comes from this brilliant historical parallel. Back in 1952, a French demographer named Alfred Sauvy looked at the world and was reminded of his own country's history, of pre-revolutionary France. See, back then, French society was split into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate the nobility. They had all the power, all the cash, all the privilege. But the vast majority of people, the engine of the entire nation, the folks who were ignored and exploited but held all the potential for change, they were the third estate. And as a famous revolutionary pamphlet asked, what is the third estate? Everything. Sauvy saw the world's newly independent nations as this new global third estate, not aligned with the capitalist nobility or the communist clergy, but ready to forge their own destiny. It was never about economics, it was about political liberation.
Now, to really get how revolutionary this idea of a third way was, we need to kind of time travel back to the world it was born into. The embers of World War II were still warm. The old European empires that had dominated the planet for centuries, they were shattered, crumbling. And right into that power vacuum rose two brand new, ideologically opposed superpowers, locking horns in this global struggle for hearts, minds, and, territory. This was the dawn of the Cold War.
This was the New World Order, a bipolar world. On one side, you had the United States, which came out of the war as an economic powerhouse, pushing its vision of free market capitalism. It locked down its sphere of influence with a ton of economic aid and, crucially, the NATO military alliance in 1949. And on the other side, the Soviet Union, with its massive Red Army promoting a totally competing vision of communism. It formalized its own power bloc with the Warsaw Pact in 1955 as a direct counter to NATO. The world was literally split in two, ideologically, economically, and militarily. So if you were a new nation just trying to get on your feet, the pressure to choose a side was absolutely immense.
And this quote from U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles just perfectly captures the intense, almost religious vibe of the era. He saw being neutral not as a principled stance, but as immoral and short-sighted. In the black and white worldview of Washington back then, you were either with the forces of freedom and light, or you were helping slavery and darkness. There was no middle ground, absolutely no room for nuance. And you better believe that sentiment was echoed in Moscow, which saw any country not on the socialist path as just a tool for Western imperialism. So the choice for these brand new nations was stark. Join our club, accept our protection, use our economic model, or be treated as an enemy.
But against this backdrop of just incredible superpower pressure, something truly extraordinary was happening. A tidal wave of change that had been building for a long time finally broke across the globe. From Asia to Africa, one by one, colonies were throwing off the shackles of empire and claiming their independence. And listen, this wasn't just a few new countries popping up on a map. This was the birth of a new global consciousness, a new political force. The Third World was literally rising from the ashes of empire.
And it happened with just breathtaking speed. I mean, the wave kicked off in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan from Britain, a massive event that freed nearly 400 million people. Just 2 years later, Indonesia won its independence from the Dutch after a brutal 4-year fight. And then, that spark just ignited a whole continent. In 1957, Ghana's independence became this huge symbol of hope for all of sub-Saharan Africa. And it all led to 1960, the incredible year of Africa, when 17 new nations were born. The process kept going right through the mid-1970s with the final collapse of Portugal's empire. In less than a single generation, the political map of the entire world was fundamentally and irrevocably redrawn.
So what was the actual result of this wave? Well, look at this number, 99.
When the United Nations was founded in 1945, it had just 51 members, and it was pretty much dominated by Western powers. But by 1960, that number had almost doubled to 99. Now, this wasn't just some bureaucratic change. This was a seismic shift in global power. All of a sudden, the halls of the UN General Assembly were filled with new voices from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, nations with a shared history of being colonized, and a shared fierce desire to protect their brand new sovereignty. A new majority, a new global public opinion was starting to take shape.
But these new nations faced some pretty daunting challenges. Independence was just step one. They inherited economies that were designed to ship resources back to their colonial masters, not to benefit their own people. They were stuck with these random borders drawn in Europe that often cut right across ethnic lines, basically planting seeds for future conflict. And hanging over all of it was that intense pressure from the Cold War superpowers. They realized pretty quickly that to survive, to avoid just becoming pawns in a new global game, they couldn't stand alone. They had to band together and forge a united voice.
And these were the architects of that new vision. You had Jawaharlal Nehru of India, a brilliant intellectual pushing for peaceful coexistence. There was Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, a fiery nationalist who totally electrified the developing world by standing up to Britain and France over the Suez Canal. You had Sukarno of Indonesia, a revolutionary who dreamed of this grand coalition of free states. From Africa, there was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who was constantly warning about neo-colonialism, the danger of being controlled economically, even after you're politically free. And then there was this fascinating wild card, Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia. He was a communist, yeah, but one who had famously broken with Stalin's Soviet Union, which put him in a unique spot to build bridges and carve out a path that was independent of Moscow. These 5 very different leaders started connecting, united by one goal: resist the pull of the superpowers and create a real third way.
All their efforts came together at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. This was the moment the Third World went from being an idea to a political reality. For the first time in history, 29 nations from Asia and Africa, representing over half of all humanity, got together to talk about their shared problems and chart a common future. And here's the key: they did it without the presence or permission of their former colonial masters. This wasn't just another meeting, it was the birth of a global political force.
The host, Indonesia's President Sukarno, just captured the epic significance of the moment with these electrifying words. I mean, think about it. For centuries, world history had been written in European capitals. International conferences were just gatherings of Western dudes deciding the fate of everyone else. Bandung completely shattered that reality. It was a powerful statement that the people of Africa and Asia were no longer just passive subjects of history, but active agents of their own destiny. The psychological impact of this, the sense of shared identity it created, was just immense. You really can't overstate it.
And out of Bandung came 10 core principles that would become the foundation of their movement. You can see they put down some fundamental ideas, like respect for human rights, sovereignty, and the equality of all nations, big and small. But the really crucial ones were about non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs. This was a direct, deliberate rejection of both the old colonial mindset of domination and the new Cold War practice of superpowers messing with other governments. This was their ethical charter, their code of conduct for a new, more just world.
The Bandung spirit was a powerful idea for sure, but an idea needs an institution to keep it going. And that institution was born 6 years later, in 1961, at a summit in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Hosted by Tito, 25 nations officially launched the Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM. And that made it official. There was now a formal, organized group of nations committed to navigating a path of independence right between the two superpower blocks. And notice they called it a movement, not an alliance. That was on purpose, to show its flexibility and its focus on shared principles, not rigid military pacts.
All right, so armed with a clear set of principles and a formal organization, the non-aligned movement was ready to make some moves. But could this collection of mostly poor, developing nations, many of them just a few years old, really make a difference in a world run by the nuclear-armed US and Soviet Union? Well, the answer, surprisingly, was yes. They found their power not in money or missiles, but in their moral authority, and, as time went on, in their sheer numbers.
This chart just lays out the stark economic reality they were up against. By the early 80s, the First World, the wealthy West, had only 15% of the world's people, but controlled a staggering 55% of its economic output. The Third World, on the other hand, was home to a majority of humanity, 52%, but generated only a fifth of the world's GDP. This colossal inequality wasn't an accident. It was a direct legacy of colonialism. And this is what fueled the Third World's agenda. Their fight wasn't just for political respect. It was a demand for fundamental economic justice.
So what did they actually do with their collective voice? Well, at the UN, their growing majority became a powerful diplomatic weapon. They passed resolution after resolution supporting the last remaining colonies fighting for freedom. They led the global campaign to isolate apartheid South Africa, pushing for the sanctions that helped bring that racist regime to its knees. They became the main international champions for the cause of Palestinian self-determination. And on the global stage, they were this constant moral voice for peace, demanding nuclear disarmament from the superpowers. Then in the 70s, they went even further, demanding a new international economic order, a whole set of radical proposals to restructure global trade and finance to give developing nations a fairer shot.
And what's so crucial to understand is that non-alignment never meant just sitting on the sidelines. The movement's leaders always insisted their stance was one of positive neutrality or active non-alignment. They weren't isolationists at all. They were deeply engaged in world affairs, but they were doing it on their own terms. They offered to mediate conflicts, they proposed peace plans to de-escalate tensions, and they constantly used their moral platform to call out the actions of both Washington and Moscow. They were trying to build a third path, not just hide from the other two.
Of course, the path was never easy. I mean, holding together such a huge and diverse coalition of countries, each with its own interests, is an incredibly tough job. The movement faced serious internal divisions and relentless outside pressures that were always threatening to tear it apart. And then the Cold War itself ended, forcing the movement to face this huge existential question. If there are no longer two blocks to be non-aligned between, what's our purpose now?
Yeah. The ideal of solidarity often crashed against the hard rocks of reality. Nothing showed the movement's limits more than the brutal Iran-Iraq War, which saw two founding members locked in a deadly 8-year conflict, while NAM basically stood by, powerless to stop it. Ideological splits were also a huge problem. At the 1979 summit in Havana, the host, Fidel Castro, argued that the Soviet Union was the natural ally of the movement, which caused a massive rift with moderates who fought to keep the movement truly non-aligned. And in reality, a lot of members bent the rules, forming close ties with one superpower or the other to get security or economic aid, like Egypt did with the US or India did with its treaty with the USSR. Unity was a constant and often losing battle.
So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the whole concept of non-alignment seemed, well, obsolete. The bipolar world was gone. A lot of people in the West predicted the movement would just fade into irrelevance. But it didn't. Instead, it adapted. Its mission evolved from navigating a two-power world to resisting a one-power or unipolar world dominated by the United States. The focus shifted from political non-alignment to defending multilateralism and national sovereignty, and to fighting for the interests of the developing world, now often called the Global South, in an age of rapid globalization.
And this is the result. Far from being some historical relic, the non-aligned movement is very much alive. Today, it has 120 member states. That's nearly 2/3 of the entire United Nations, and they represent over half the people on this planet. It's still the second largest international organization in the world, right after the UN itself. Its focus might have shifted to 21st century issues like climate justice and sustainable development, but it's still a vital platform for the collective voice of the developing world.
And that brings us right back to our world, today. We're living in what a lot of people are calling a new era of great power competition. This intense rivalry between the United States and a rising China is creating those familiar pressures on countries all over the world to once again choose a side, to align with one camp or the other. Which leaves us with a final pretty provocative thought. In this new reality, is the original spirit of Bandung, that core idea of non-alignment, of refusing to be a pawn in someone else's great game, more relevant now than it has been in decades?
The story of the Third World really proves that history isn't just shaped by superpowers, it's shaped by the collective will of those who refuse to pick a side. It's a complex legacy, and it's one that continues to unfold today. To dive even deeper into all of this, make sure you visit our website. We've put together some really in-depth notes and mind wraps covering everything we talked about. Thanks for watching.